Hey everyone, thanks for coming. I appreciate that. So I'm SueAnn Shiah, and we're here to kind of talk about my film and kind of not talk about my film. So Kenji has seen it, and as you can tell, this is not Sunshine Ra, or maybe you can't. Um, I mean, that's not about us. That's about white people's inability to tell Asian people apart. So,
True. Starting with the fire.
Yeah, but this is Cicia Lee, and she generously decided to jump in. She has many important and thoughtful things to contribute, despite the fact that she has not seen my film. Your worth is not based on whether or not you've seen my film. All right, so I'm SueAnn. I'm gonna let these guys introduce themselves to you, and then I'll kind of tell you a little bit about myself. Kenji, do you want to start?
Sure. Hello.
Okay.
Yeah. Hello.
No, okay, pass it
Welcome. I'm Kenji Kuramitsu, and this is my 7th and final panel of Wild Goose. So sorry.
It's also his birthday.
So,
It's
yeah,
also
it's
his
my
birthday, so
Sorry.
happy birthday, Kenji!
Thank you. I'm sorry if you're hearing the same things over and over. For me, at least. I go to McCormick Seminary in Chicago, the shirt that gentleman is wearing, and I'm a 5th generation Japanese American. You can maybe say more.
We were going to talk about the history of our names as well.
Oh, for the opening?
Yeah, go for
Yeah,
it.
sure. I'd love to. So the history of my name, we did a little bit of this in Anna Jelsi's name reclamation workshop that I really loved. So maybe in 2 minutes or so. My full name is Ryan Kenji Kuramitsu, and my sisters and I all were given Japanese, American, and Hawaiian names by our parents to sort of impose upon us the idea that we should have some sort of connection to our ancestral and cultural context in Hawaii and Japan. So I started going by my first middle name, Kenji, about 2 years ago, and that was actually after I took a trip to a Japanese-American concentration camp where not my family members were incarcerated. That was a different site, but on a pilgrimage with young people who had grandparents and family members there. That was a really crystallizing event for me and my identity as an Asian American, and I think that part of the name reclamation of sort of choosing to use my more tricky first middle name and to have it seep into me was sort of resulting from that experience. Final thing about my name is that because my birth certificate was issued in English because I was born in the United States, I don't have kanji, which is what the Japanese call Chinese letterings, for my middle names. So when I started using Kenji more regularly, I kind of got to choose my own kanji, which is the traditional Chinese way of writing names. And we'll get into this, but there's an extraordinary amount of detail and complexity that goes into that. So it was actually about a year ago that I was following the story of Kenji Goto. Is anyone familiar with that name? He was a Japanese journalist who traveled to Syria to try to rescue his friend who had been kidnapped by ISIS. He was also captured and then publicly killed after a really long and emotional campaign from Japanese citizens to try to save his life. So feeling that connection and following that story pretty closely after he died, I looked up what his kanji was, how he wrote his name, and sort of took that as my own and brought that to my parents. And this isn't like an official thing. It will never apply on a form. I'm never going to use that in the U.S. to write my name. But it was a really powerful thing of reclamation. So that's a little bit about why I chose my name and how I chose it.
My name is Cicia Lee, Cicia Lee, and my Chinese name Xingye, Li Xingye is how you say it in Chinese. It was really thoughtfully crafted, and when I was born, my mom looked up all of these different astrological charts for what my element was, where the positions of all the stars would be. And so, there's kind of a Chinese astrology around what energy I have the most of and will be lacking, and then they write whatever you're missing into your name so that you're balanced. Oh, wow. And my Chinese name is written with 2 signs. The 3 words of 2 of them have the symbol for life in it, and then the other 2 have the symbol for day and the symbol for flower, and one of them also uses this traditional royal character as a part of it. And so it's this like beautifully intricate name, and I never identified as Xingye in American or Canadian context. I've always gone by my first name, Cicia. And actually, Cicia doesn't have any meaning that I can connect deeply with. I think my mom actually adapted the name Cicia from Cecilia, and she was reading kind of a lot of Austrian history and didn't want something that was recognizable, and so adapted it. And I actually get the question a lot of like, where does your name come from? And I often feel like ashamed or embarrassed that it's Kenji just spoke about liminal spaces in his last talk, and I feel sometimes really embarrassed that my name feels like a liminal space too. It's like my mom was drawn to this Western history but didn't totally identify with it, and gave me something that was also kind of in the middle. And that's like too complex to explain when someone asks me, you know,
what's your name?
Yeah, what does your name mean?
What does that mean?
No, I can't explain this to you. But actually, I feel really sad that I can't claim the poetry that's in my Chinese name. And there's this one really moving moment when I was in high school. I also went by Cicia, but there was a transfer student. There's an international student from China who studied Chinese literature when he was in China, and he asked me what my Chinese name was, and so I told him it was Li Xingye, and I told him how to write it. He was like, "Wow, your name is like poetry." And I felt so moved because this person that I barely knew could tell the significance and the thoughtfulness of what my mom had crafted. And it was the first time in like, you know, my 16 years of life that someone was able to recognize that.
Also, can you give a little background about, you know, you already said you're
Identify
Chinese.
as Chinese Canadian American. Yeah.
Yeah.
Dual citizen. Another liminal thing.
And you were born in China. And
Oh, yeah. Okay, great. I was born in China. I lived in England for a few years. I lived in Canada most of my life and recently moved to the U.S. Now I live in Boston. My family's in Michigan. Great.
Yeah, it's really funny. We literally just met yesterday, and we found out we grew up like an hour from each other. I on the Detroit side and her on the Windsor side, the Canadian side. And we actually know like some of the same people. I know, it's great. All the way in North Carolina, and here we are. I am SueAnn Shiah, and it's interesting listening to you talk about, you know, how much you see in your mother through the composition of your name, because I also feel that very deeply. So like I said, I grew up in Detroit, the third born child of two people who had immigrated from Taiwan to the United States. And my parents did this for all of us, where they first picked our Chinese names. It was just like, we're just gonna pick Chinese names for you guys. And then while they were doing that, they were kind of like thoughtful, like, oh, we're gonna like anglicize that, and you're gonna go by something similar to that when, like, in America, like on your birth certificate. So they like didn't pick stuff that was like gonna be really hard, or like, so my brother's name's Poen, my sister's name's Joan Lee, and I'm SueAnn. But since I moved to the South, people like think I'm gonna be like some like sweet, like super Southern lady when they meet me, and then I'm like, no, it's Chinese, it's not Southern. Like SueAnn is actually derivative of my Chinese name. So in Chinese, the last name comes first, and that's important, as we will talk about, in your identity. So it's Xia, which is the character for summer, which is more prominent in the southwestern provinces of China, which we also realize our family are from that region as well. And then SueAnn. So my parents did this thing where it's actually like another like Chinese classical poetic kind of thing, where like based on our birth order, the first character of our name was the number, and it meant a number in like a classical sense. So my brother's, you know, first character, it means like the firstborn. My sister's is the second, and mine's the third. So Su, it actually means the third born son. And then An, which like sounds like SueAnn, sounds really good anglicized. My mom told me she also was thinking of like Ping, which is actually a synonym for the word An, but like Su Ping sounds like super fobby, and so I think my parents like SueAnn will probably work, but we're not even gonna unpack fobbiness, right? It's like, sorry, for people who don't know what fob means, it's like a fresh off the boat, FOB. There's actually a TV show called Fresh Off the Boat. I don't know if how many people here have seen the show? Oh, that's pretty good. Yeah. so it's a story about a Taiwanese American family, and yeah, so and I also was like born in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So my parents were like, that kind of works, like SueAnn. But SueAnn in English is very feminine. It's two girls' names put together, very like Southern ladies, right? But actually, in Chinese, my mom purposely chose an androgynous name for me because her name is very, very feminine. It's like two word, like it's all like flowery and like there's in Chinese names, a lot of times people pick characters that are like really girly or like flowers or pretty when they name their daughters. My mom didn't want anyone to know I was a girl just by my name. So a lot of people actually, like when I was like in class and they were like calling roll and looking at my Chinese name in Chinese school, they were like looking for a boy. Because like I mentioned, the Su character actually means like the third uncle, like the third son, like, and it's the same word as the word for uncle. And it has a feminine form, which means ladylike, which is not my name. People always assume that that was my name. Like I mentioned, I'm Taiwanese American, and HuanDao, which is part of the title of this panel, is the name of my feature-length documentary. As you may have read in the description, I went back to Taiwan, which is where my parents are from, and I circumnavigated, I biked the perimeter of the country. And in that, I wanted to explore, go back to my roots and engage with a deeper understanding of what it meant to be Taiwanese, and particularly Taiwanese American for myself. And so this panel, while like we're going to be referencing every once in a while some things that have happened in my film, just as launching points. Obviously, none of you have seen it except for my friend Megan, who's sitting in the front row. She's out in my living room, and but we hope that these are stories still that that you can find value in some way, take away, and also like I'm trying to screen my film, in colleges, universities, community centers, churches. So we'll talk a little bit more about the value of narrative, particularly in the Asian American community. So why make a film about this? The genre of Asian American media is very young. We were just talking about this, the three of us, yesterday in planning for this. And there's a writer I really like, a poet and writer, her name is Jenny Zhang. And she did an interview just this week that came out. And she talked about how because the canon for Asian American literature and media is still not really set, everything that we are writing, and her, as a writer, is actually in the process of creating it. As we mentioned, this show, Fresh Off the Boat, aired within the last few years. It's the only second show to ever existed to have shown an Asian American family, the first one featuring Margaret Cho. Even the fact that it's 2016, like it's taken a really long time. We think about like the Cosby Show as being like that breaking point for like African American families and narratives, and like here we are. It's taken a long time. We're still working on it. There's not a lot that exists. Like I mentioned, Sue Chan-ra couldn't be here, but he said in his like presentation on Lamentations yesterday that like with the last 10 books you've read, how many of them were written by people of color or women? Right? If your books are all being written by white men, you maybe need to like diversify your reading list. In the same way, what are the last 10 shows you watched on TV? What are the last 10 films you saw? How many of them featured the narrative of an Asian American person, and that they weren't just like a minority sidekick, they weren't just exist to make sure that the lead character doesn't look racist, like. So that's the reason why I made this film, was because narratives like this, they don't exist in a lot, to be honest. Have you guys felt that in your own personal experience, like the lack of narratives, Asian American narratives in particular?
Yeah, for those who came in just now, I'm not Sung Chan Ra, as SueAnn hinted to. He couldn't be with us, but I'm Kenji Kuramitsu, again, hi. Some of the narratives that I feel like are told about Asian Americans are maybe you've seen that great TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie of The Danger of a Single Story. I think Asian American communities can, basically, if you haven't, she's talking about like, don't just take a people and insist they have one story and that's all they are. If Asian Americans get a story and get a hearing and representation in theology, right, in classrooms, in media, at events like Wild Goose, if we get a story, it's one story. It's narrowed to one thing, and it doesn't really reveal the complexity of what it is to be Asian American, of belonging to different generational cohorts, right? By that I mean I'm 5th generation Asian American, first and 1.5, meaning like, and that kind of means like my great-great-grandparents came to Hawaii and then to the US, right? That's a very different experience from newer Asian immigrants today, although we've faced some of the same similar, like, where are you really from kind of questions, and are racialized in similar ways. The single story around Asian Americans doesn't really point to the fact that there are dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of ethnic and cultural groups, and they often hate each other in what we call Asia, but in the West, right, a lot of times the assumption is just Asian means one thing, you look like one thing, and there's that image that crops into mind. So I guess particularly for me, as someone who's trying to do theology, the dearth of Asian American representation means that, like, we don't have the luxury of hating each other. And I mean that jokingly, like, we get along a lot, but if we didn't, there's no other Asian Americans here, right? So we have to, like, be friends, sort of, which is like, it's kind of the bind we're in. Yeah, I will like you no matter who you are, essentially. So that's just something about representation, maybe especially in theology when we're sort of reading books like the Seung-chan talked about, the past 10 theology books were probably written by people of, like, only European descent, and that just doesn't honor the experiences of our communities.
And I would argue even, like, the idea of people like, oh, they're just movies, they're just TV, it's just entertainment. But the thing is that storytelling, you know, this entire festival's, like, core theme is storytelling. Why storytelling? You know, like, why is this important? And the reason is that, like, we, you know, sometimes we talk about theology in abstract a lot as, like, these, like, rules or statutes or things that we know, but theology is derivative of narrative. Like, we look at most of the Bible isn't, like, law books. It's actually just stories about people, and what we know about God and what we know about Jesus comes from the stories that we hear from the Bible. And even, like, Jesus, when you read about how Jesus spoke, he always used stories to talk to people in parables, and that's part of a really long-standing Jewish rabbinical tradition. And in many ways, like, in our modern society, I feel like I've heard this like 10 times this weekend already, so I feel like a broken record a little bit, but, like, what perspectives are our theologies coming from? It has to do with the narratives that in many ways, like, those come out of, but also the narratives of those who are interpreting them.
Yeah, and I would love to say something else about the narrative piece. I think one thing that's important to me is, like, how telling my own story is a part of my own healing, and I think part of what you're saying about writing a new canon for Asian American literature, it's like a part of our collective healing. As kind of
not even new canon, just a canon.
A canon, the first canon of Asian American experience. That's ridiculous. Yeah. And what it has meant for me is that I grew up without any kind of, like, narrative to map my own experience onto, and so about Asian Americanness, and so all I had was, like, white culture, you know, or, like, Chinese culture, and it felt very clear to me that I no longer fit into the Chinese culture, that story, and actually that's really tragic to me. There's, like, a lot of sadness and the brokenness between, like, my current story and the story of my family and the story of my people. I just, like, don't even know most of that story. And so what I've mapped onto is, like, white narrative, you know, white culture.
I definitely experienced that too.
Yeah, and I mean, I've done that to survive, you know. I had to do that to not be bullied as a child. Like, I have to make sure that I can speak well, I can write well, I know all the cultural references, and, you know, it served me really well. And now I think what I know is that what that did is it stripped me of my ability to, like, know my own story and to have a story that I could resonate with more authentically.
The next thing that we're kind of going to move into is to talk about the way that language interacts with all this. And I know that we're talking from an Asian American perspective for all of us, but this is often true for most children of immigrants, in that part of the reason that the erasure of that narrative exists, that those narratives are lost, is because of a loss of that language between generations. Like, I can't, like, when I can actually get my very deaf grandmother to hear the question that I'm asking, what she answers in, like, I can only half understand. And like Kenji, like you've talked about, like you have a different experience, even more so as like a much later generation.
Yeah, absolutely. We were talking about this a little bit last night. As a Japanese American whose family's been here for 130 years, here meaning like Hawaii and then the U.S., I don't, and many of my peers don't have Japanese language ability. It's not something that was taught to us because it's not something that was taught to our parents because of the World War II concentration camp experience. When language teaching was forbidden and when Japanese Americans needed to, literally to survive, stop speaking and teaching this language to our children. So a lot of the legitimacy issues that I have and had about being Asian American as a kid would actually crop up when I would hang out with other Asian Americans and realize I'd lost my ancestral language through no fault of my own, but any person who has lost that somewhere along the way by whatever means feels some kind of way about it. And so that's definitely my experience as a Japanese American and who doesn't like have that saliency. It's frustrating in some ways. I can't tell you, probably 3 people have spoken Japanese to me when they meet me at Wild Goose, right? Because they assume like something about me because of my face or because of my name, my chosen name. But this is all to say, like, to go back to that story, there's not just one Asian American story. If we're going to create these new canons and new testaments, we need to be allowed the opportunity to speak and to do so.
Yeah, and I wanted to also share like a short story about the language gap and how painful that is. I just did a presentation with 3 of my dearest friends, and it was like really moving. It was like I felt totally in my heart and my body, and I felt like what we were saying was really, really meaningful to me, and it was like my vocation to be there sharing this vision that we had. And it's just in my mind, as we're talking about the language gap, it's like so juxtaposed with the last time I went back to China. I go to China maybe like once every 4 years or so. So I've seen my extended family 3 times in my life, my aunts and cousins and grandparents. And I was in China and I was talking to my aunt who raised me for the first 3 years of my life while my parents had immigrated to England. My aunt raised me and she loved me so dearly. My uncle told me the story of like when I left to England with my mom, my aunt cried for 3 weeks because she missed me so much. And I was back in China a few years ago. I had just graduated from college, and she asked me, like, Cicia, what did you study in school? And I was like, oh, I studied economics and philosophy. And she was like, and first of all, I couldn't even say those words. I didn't know what the word
I was like,
for,
seriously, how did you, like...
I still actually can't remember what the Chinese words are for philosophy. So I had to, like, ask my mom to translate what I studied. And then my aunt was like, why did you study that? You know, why was it meaningful for you? And it was really important to me what I studied. You know, it set me on this path of like working on justice, and you know, like it was rooted in my faith, and you know how I believed in this radical Jesus, and how much I cared about ending inequality and like political economic philosophy. There are like so many swirling thoughts that have shaped me, and I had no words to communicate any of that to my aunt. I think I said something like, there are some people who don't have money, and I think we should care about them. I think that's the extent of what I knew how to say. And just like the relational gap that like felt immeasurably incrossable, so painful.
I think there's this lie, you know, in the modern church a lot of the times that you need to like go to Bible school or seminary, you need to know all these things and systematic theologies, and particularly like as evangelists to do that. And I actually was listening to the teaching of like a Taiwanese guy when I was living there for a little bit, and he was talking about, this was like within Taiwan, so he was like, so he like spoke Mandarin because that was like what the government had, you know, decided was the unifying language. Everyone was going to learn Mandarin in schools, and because of that, he didn't really speak Taiwanese, which was the language that hit like the dialect of Chinese that his family spoke. And so after he became a Christian and like went into full-time ministry, and you know studied in like Western style seminaries and all this stuff, like he couldn't even figure out how to explain the gospel to his dad. And he was like, this is when I realized all of that stuff, it didn't really matter as much as my ability to tell stories, because my dad gets stories. You know, like I can tell him a story, like my broken childlike Taiwanese, I can tell him a story, you know, and he gets that. He understands the story of the prodigal son, right? Like he gets that. And and all these other things that made me realize like, oh, maybe that's part of like my own internalized racism, the values that I've put on the books, and not to say that I actually really love books and I love reading theology, but like that's not the key, you know? And language is a huge part of that. And I think that like that's why storytelling, like that's why I was saying like theology isn't before storytelling. Theology comes after storytelling. So in this language stuff, you guys have both talked about your struggles with that. My personal one, I grew up speaking Mandarin in the house, and then being forced to attend Chinese school pretty much every Saturday until I was like 15, 16 maybe. And I really hated it, to be honest. Really didn't want to be there. Would much rather have like been like the white kids and like had a Saturday to hang out instead of, and I had to do homework for that too. So it was like, oh, I'm rushing to finish all this homework and like memorize all these passages in Chinese. And like that to say, me and like I ended up studying Chinese again in college because I realized that I had become distant, and I realized that for my own identity in that aspect, and I knew that the key to unlocking that was language, and that if I ever want to get further in understanding everything, I really needed to intentionally study the language. And my school had a really like terribly small Chinese department, so I started at the highest level that was offered, and I had nowhere to go after that. So I was like, okay, well, I have to go back to Taiwan. I have to immerse. I have to be with my people. My school didn't have any programs in Taiwan. So I had to like find, like I had to scour the catalogs of many universities to find a school that I could dual enroll in for a summer to bring like college credit back in order to do that. But here's the thing, the whole point of this is to say, it was a long and hard process and I was determined to do it. But the thing is, not everybody has the luxury of being able to have the money and the time to invest into spending like all this to study their language. And it's sad to me that is like the barrier, and that's the requirement to having access to your own stories, which is why in many ways like Asian American narratives that are like in the languages that we feel comfortable speaking in on ourselves, like not to say that like it's not important that we have connection to our mother tongues in many ways, but like I look to like Sandra Cisneros as one of my favorite writers, and the way she interweaves Spanish into her work, it seeks seamlessly to a person like me who's bilingual and grew up in a bilingual household. And I'm like, I want to continue to see more works like that which can integrate these sentiments, but in a way that's accessible for larger populations of Asian Americans who can't go back, right? Who can't invest years studying a language. That to say, the name of the film, which is HuanDao, I wanted to talk about that a little bit. HuanDao is like it means a circumnavigation of an island, because there's not a really good direct translation into English for that. But so you can HuanDao like on a train, on a bicycle, on a moped, on foot. I actually meet a guy who is walking the entire country in the film. And so so that's the name of the journey that I took, is a HuanDao. And when I was kind of like dreaming up like this film, I was like, oh, I don't know what I'm gonna call it. So I just working title, HuanDao. But as time went on, I couldn't find another title for it, and I kept on thinking like, man, I don't want it to be HuanDao because like that's super inaccessible. Like it says nothing to any like person who doesn't speak Chinese about what the film means. But the longer I sat with it, the more I realized like I really wanted to use that name, and I'm actually okay. So the word Dao means island, and then this word Huan means journey. Okay, so in Chinese we have like a lot of words that sound the same. Okay, and it's all about context. And a lot of these words that sound the same, they use the same primary characters, but they switch out like a radical, which is almost like a root word. So this one here, this is like Huan. That's like I wrote that wrong actually. My Chinese is rusty. But that's like the concept that ties it to a journey and land. So it's like a land journey root word. So Huan. But this word, Huan, which is much more commonly seen in Chinese, is the word for return. So you could say my film is like, oh, a circumnavigation of island, or you can say if you hear it just said out loud, it sounds the exact same as the return to the island. And this is an example of like, this took a lot of years of study for me to figure stuff like this out. But it has meaning for me. And it's like, and it's such a Chinese way of like saying and implying things, to be honest, that like, that's what I wanted. Anyway, let's see. The next thing that I kind of want to talk about is indigenous peoples. And in the film, I decide I want to visit Taiwanese Aboriginals, which, like, when people think about Taiwan and discuss what it means to be Taiwanese, it's actually this tension of a discussion between Han Chinese. Han is an ethnic group, of the largest ethnic group of Chinese people. They immigrated from the province of Fuzhou, 300 years ago, Ming Qing dynasty, and then also a new wave of people who had come from China post the Chinese Civil War, in the 50s. And my family actually my family was displaced because of war. So, it's a long journey, but, eventually they ended up in Taiwan. And, but my grandparents all, started in mainland China. So in the conversation about what it means to be Taiwanese American, I'm often discounted because I'm what they call a Weisenren, or a person who was born not here. Okay? What's unfortunate about this discussion about what it means to be Taiwanese is that no one actually ever talks about the Aboriginal people who've been living there for thousands of years before all these Chinese people showed up. And for me, I wanted to know Taiwan. When I say I'm Taiwanese, I want to know not just the part of that identity that's my own ethnic group, but also all the people who've ever called Taiwan home. Because in many ways, if we exist in this land together, our narratives are shared. And I was just riding through the village, and then they were like, "Hey, are you lost? why are you even here? Why, nobody comes to see us." And then they're like, "Are you hungry?" And Cicia, you'll get this. And I was like, a little. Which means I was super, super hungry to even admit that I was hungry at all, because Chinese people were like, "No, I'm fine, I'm fine." I had been biking 40 miles and I had not eaten in 6 hours. So I was like, a little. And then they invited me, and we just sat and we talked for 3 or 4 hours. And I found so many intersections between their displacement and their existence as a subordinate within a dominant Han culture, with my own tensions of being an Asian American person in America. And I know that Kenji has his own history of these kind of issues to deal with in.
Yeah, absolutely, a little bit. So I mentioned my family comes from the cultural context of Hawaii. So my great-great-grandparents and great-grandparents on both sides moved to the Big Island of Hawaii to work as sugarcane laborers and to start a garage as a mechanic on one side, or as mechanics on the other side. This was done very intentionally. The Japanese government and the Kingdom of Hawaii created an agreement essentially where, I don't want to say trafficked, but imported labor was sort of piped in to fund the plantations. So the Kingdom of Hawaii, under the control or influence at least of white U.S. business owners and missionaries, brought in Filipino people, Chinese people, Korean people, Japanese people, and Portuguese people to be the overseers of the plantations called Luna, where they rode around on horses with bullwhips to make sure the workers were doing their job. So this was an intentional strategy to sort of both push out the native Hawaiian population, the Kanaka, the indigenous people of Hawaii, and to get different ethnic groups that didn't have a shared language. It's like Tower of Babel stuff, so they couldn't organize. So if you've actually ever heard the Hawaiian Pidgin language that developed out of a successful attempt of these communities of merging Spanish and Portuguese, people from Puerto Rico were there as well, and Filipino and Hawaiian and Japanese and Korean and English into a dialect that could be shared across different ethnic communities to organize together. So thinking about my family history in this context of SueAnn's question of indigeneity, there's very few people, I think, maybe let's just say at this festival or in the US, who are living in the lands that their ancestors have traditionally lived in. I mean, it may feel like if your great-grandparent went to the same high school you did, or your grandparents went there, yeah, but before that there was another people group living there if you're living in North America, or what we call North America. And so thinking about that, I know that when I'm in Japan, I visited for the first time this year, I'm an American. You know, there's no connection in terms of family, in terms of language, in terms of legal recognition for citizenship or any of that stuff, because we left so long ago and were sent as laborers. But here, I know it's also not my home or my ancestral context. I think the closest I can feel is Hawaii, although I still know that although many of my cousins, uncles, and aunties have indigenous Hawaiian heritage, our family came as a part of a pattern to sort of break that up, and an exploited group used to create wealth for a small group of people. So I think that while I claim Hawaii most acutely as my community or the sense of being belonging or culturally, ethnically, ancestrally at home, that's just a complicated dynamic for me in particular in thinking about all of those things.
Yeah, and obviously for me, like as a Taiwanese person, to consider that even as well. And I think that we've seen throughout the festival that most of us are unpacking what it means to have like been part of the colonizers. I know that Cicia has her own story that with this. Do you want to share that or?
I can share something about your indigeneity.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, so Han Chinese people are kind of the most common in
It's like 99.5% of China is Han people.
But there's actually a really rich diversity of minority indigenous groups, and so my family is half Han and half Bai, Bison, which is another minority group. And I was at an organizing training actually in January, and I was sitting in a small group with this person who is a Mexican immigrant, and this person who is there representing the Hupa tribe in Northern California. And we were all learning how to organize together. And we were talking about our stories, the stories of our families and why we were organizing. And I mentioned something about like, part of my identity as an Asian American is that I don't have a sense of home. And this woman in the representing the Hupa tribe, she was like, I don't understand that because my whole life and all of my organizing has been rooted in the land that I know so deeply as my home. And I was like, wow, the whole rest of my family knows that truth, and my immediate family has chosen capitalism, the dream of America, instead of our roots, instead of our family. And the other woman I was with, Celeste, she was talking about like, you know, Cicia, you come from an indigenous people, and like she was like, so does my family, and our families go back thousands and thousands of years. Our people are around for like 5,000 years, and we have so much power in that. And part of the tragedy of American colonialism and whiteness and capitalism is that not only has that been ripped away from us, it's like our parents have bought into this shallow, shallow dream that has erased our entire history of our indigenous people.
We all have been displaced or moved for one reason or another. And I think that, if anything, I've always noticed this with, like you were saying, with the Asian American community, is a sense of, like, where's my home? And that is a theme that throughout my film I keep asking. I keep asking of different people with different stories, with different backgrounds, who ascribe Taiwan as their place. But most of all, like, I can talk about this little island, you know, in the like South China Sea, that probably actually is more influential to your day-to-day life than you realize. But like, what do we all have to take away from that? For me, the journey taught me not only what it meant to be Taiwanese American, but it also made me think about what it meant to be American as well. Let me tell you a quick little story. There's a place with indigenous people who've been living there for thousands of years. And then about like 400 years ago, a bunch of people come and they settle that. And then, you know, like 60 years ago, a bunch of people came. And those people from 400 years ago are like, you're not us. You're not us. Even though, you know, like you actually came from the same country that we did. You're not like us. We are the real people of these people. Does that sound familiar to any of you guys? like our stories are linked. Like you were talking about, like your background is, mixed in this indigenous people in like Yunnan. But like when I talk to, but you talk to another indigenous person from a completely different continent, and there's threads, and in that same way, like what happens in Taiwan, while it doesn't always directly affect you in ways you realize, there's a story there that has value for people who claim this very large continent, which in some ways is an island, as their home as well. And that in so many ways is the value of narrative, not just for Asian Americans and finding their own place in society, but also for the rest of everybody else who's attempting to contextualize their existence in this society. Are there any other thoughts that you guys want to have? I think we'll do like questions and response if people have stuff.
I want to say a quick thing, kind of jumping a few threads back to something Kenji was saying about the monolithic story. And I think part of our work as Asian Americans is also to be able to identify privilege in our own communities.
Yeah.
And one thing that actually isn't talked about that much in the Asian American community that I'm aware of is like, the diversity of Asian experiences. You were touching on this a little bit, and how they're mapped onto privilege and class and access and anti-blackness, and how all of those things are intersecting and interrelating. And I think like as we're beginning to write this new canon of what it means to be Asian American, and what it means to claim stories of liberation for an Asian American community, I just wanted to put that out again, that like it's not a monolithic canon, that there are a really wide diversity of Asian, South Asian, Pacific Islander stories that need to be shared as a part of this.
Thank you for pivoting to the discussion there. I'll just say from my cultural and familial context of both of my parents also are police officers, and so a lot of our conversations about race are particularly heated. But from my context and understanding, right, of coming directly just a few generations back from a trafficked people brought to a country to work as plantation labor, being exposed to mass incarceration and put in concentration camps during World War II, successfully winning reparations for this from the government. I don't think there's another way that the Asian American communities can go if we're claiming to be about justice or anything else other than directly being like a huge support and like right alongside the Black liberation movement. I think that there's the connections that are just underlying there are so many, right? So while Asian men are desexualized and made as non-threatening and comical, Black men are hypersexualized, made as threatening and sinister. Whereas Asian Americans are often the butt of the joke in our society and made farcical. It's African Americans who are at the butt of a gun. And so those connections are just something that I hope we can, continue to draw out in our own work and express solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements like that.
Yeah, and Soon Chen Rao talked about this as well, as like, no, we will not be a model minority. And in many ways, the myth of the model minority has just been a tool from white supremacy to leverage who we are against Blackness. And for me, like, I see, like, if I am silent, that implies complicity in being used as that, and I refuse. Yes, so model minority myth is the idea that if racism, if racism is real, then how come Asians actually make a higher median income than white people, right? Things like that. Some ideas that like, well, if racism real, then how come these Asian people who, they're not white, how come they're able to achieve success in the United States? Maybe if Black people just worked harder. Maybe they were just more hardworking, like those Asian people. Which is rooted in a lot. But basically we're a scapegoat. And we've honestly traded a comfortable seat next to the hand of a tyrant for that. When in reality, it's like people that we actually have more in common with are suffering because we decide to take that seat of privilege.
And there's another thing about the model minority myth, which is like Asians are smart, they're good at math, they're good engineers, they're gonna like make a lot of money, they're really reliable, they're really safe, you want them in your neighborhood, they're like not like Black people. All of that is like another way that the monolithic story of Asian Americans is inserted into our culture. Because actually, the diversity that we were talking about, like Cambodians and Hmong and Filipino, like they are not included in what counts as the model minority. You know, in Asian and even in East Asian culture, there's like if you're Cantonese speaking, and you probably immigrated earlier, and you're living in Chinatown, you're not living the same life as someone who like immigrated very late in your career as an engineer, as a professional,
My
in
dad.
order to pursue the American dream. Yeah.
Just to more strongly emphasize that, so like the ethnic groups in the U.S. that experience the highest rates of high school dropout or not achieving a high school education, and some of the highest poverty rates in the U.S. apply to just those South Asian groups that are so conveniently left out of the model minority story. I think our feeling sounds like if they wanted us to be quiet, complicit, complacent model minorities, they shouldn't have created concentration camps and exclusion acts and racialized and conscientiousized us in such a way that we would at least try to resist it in some communities.
Okay, yeah.
So, and you talked a little bit about how, like, the idea of home, and I was reading the other day about Taiwan, how many Taiwanese are now less connected to the idea of where your family came from because there's a movement for independence in Taiwan. And I know there's a little bit of a movement for independence in Hawaii too, and I wonder how movement for independence might affect Asian American stories.
Okay, so the question was about how the movement for independence in Taiwan is affecting the concept of Taiwanese identity. Is that about? And also how, for like, in obviously Kenji will speak to that about how the independence movement of Hawaii is reflective of that as well. So I would say actually there's been a pivot in the more younger generation where like there used to be this really old divide about like those are like the Weisenren and we're the Taiwanese people. And like and there was like this holding close to it. And the independence movement in Taiwan has always been driven by those who refer to themselves as Taiwanese and who have been living there for a couple hundred years. I would say that the youth of today are much less concerned about party lines, much less concerned about I am a part of this party because my family was historically a part of this party, and have united for the sake of freedom, for human rights. The only other option besides independence for Taiwan is to be annexed into communist China. And Taiwan is actually one of the countries in Asia with the highest rates of freedom of speech. It will probably be the first country in Asia to legalize gay marriage. And they have the biggest pride parades every year in Taipei. And like a bill to legalize, same-sex marriage in Taiwan has come up in legislation several times, and the newest president who just got elected, the first woman president of Taiwan, that was part of her campaign. So for those youth in Taiwan, like Taiwanese identity has come to mean like this is our home. We want to protect it and the rights that are here. And to be honest, like the tyrancy has caused that like unification in many ways.
So in the context of Hawaii, and I know we've had some conversations about this before, Austin. I get kind of emotional thinking about this. Hawaii does not belong to the United States. 100 years before I was born in 1893, the U.S. backed an illegal, under international law, coup to overthrow a democratically just elected government and monarch, Queen Liliuokalani. Since then, the U.S. has continued to occupy this territory, literally destroy it by bombing islands to test military weapons, right? So 33% of the island of Oahu, 25 to 33%, depending on how you do it, is owned currently by the U.S. military still, right? The U.S. continues to pillage and colonize the islands as an extension of the pillage and conquest of the indigenous Hawaiian women population. And Leilani Trask has done really great work about that. I'll just address briefly that the Hawaiian sovereignty movement in 2015 and 16 has experienced some of its biggest, I want to say, gains and move making in a really long time. So if you haven't been aware of what's been going on with that, I would encourage you to check it out. Yeah.
I don't think we have any more time for questions, but you can always come talk to me. I'll hang out in the back. Also, if you're interested in hosting a screening somewhere in your community, come talk to me. And I also have soundtrack, like CDs of the soundtrack for the documentary available for sale. You can ask me more about it later if you want. But yeah, anyway, thank you for your time.